A kingdom that laughs at innocent children often discovers too late that destiny has been listening. The Silver Hollow pack had gathered beneath the ancient moonstone circle on the brightest full moon of the year, where every newborn pup received a blessing meant to reveal the path the moon goddess had chosen. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in polished ceremonial clothing, their silver lanterns glowing softly beneath towering pine trees, while whispers floated through the cool night air like drifting leaves. Emily Carter stood alone near the center of the sacred clearing, her newborn twin boys wrapped carefully in a faded ivory blanket that had once belonged to her late mother. She was only 23, a quiet omega whose gentle heart had earned respect from almost no one and kindness from even fewer. Ever since her mysterious mate had vanished before the twins were born, the pack had treated her as though she carried nothing but shame beneath her tired smile. Even tonight, when every mother should have been surrounded by celebration, Emily felt the invisible wall separating her from everyone else. Elder Nathaniel slowly approached the stone altar with the carved oak staff passed down through generations, his weathered face unusually tense as he accepted the sleeping infants into his trembling arms. The clearing became perfectly silent. Every wolf watched as pale moonlight poured across the twins' tiny faces. For one hopeful heartbeat, Emily believed the goddess would silence every cruel rumor with a miracle. Instead, the moonstone remained dark. No silver glow, no sacred symbol, no whisper of destiny. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd before someone laughed. Another voice joined in. Then another. Worthless pups. One alpha muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. No alpha scent. No future. No blessing. The words rolled through the gathering until they became a chorus of quiet judgment. Emily's heart tightened, but she refused to lower her eyes. She stepped forward and gently took both babies back into her arms, pulling the blanket closer around their tiny bodies as though love alone could shield them from the cold weight of those voices. One of the older women shook her head with open disappointment. "The moon goddess has spoken," she whispered. "These boys will never lead anyone." Emily looked down at her sleeping sons. Ethan rested peacefully with one tiny hand curled around the edge of her sleeve while Noah let out the softest sigh, completely unaware that his first night beneath the moon had already become a sentence in the eyes of strangers. Tears threatened to rise, but Emily swallowed them before they could fall. Her boys would never remember this night if she could help it. They would remember warm mornings, honest work, laughter beside quiet streams, and a mother who never allowed the world to define their worth. Without another word, she turned away from the sacred circle. The laughter continued behind her, fading only as the forest welcomed her into its shadows. High above the silent trees, the full moon finally slipped free from a passing cloud, and for the briefest instant, a single silver beam followed the twins as though heaven itself refused to let them walk alone. The little cabin stood where Silver Hollow Forest met the winding edge of Cedar Creek, nearly 12 miles from the nearest pack road, hidden behind towering white pines that whispered with every passing breeze. It was small enough that most travelers never noticed it, yet to Emily Carter it became the safest place in the world. Every sunrise began the same way. She carried water from the creek in 2 worn wooden buckets, baked fresh bread from the coarse flour she traded for herbs, and watched Ethan and Noah race barefoot across the wildflower field that surrounded their home. The twins were growing quickly, their bright laughter filling every quiet corner that the pack had once filled with judgment. Emily never spoke about the night they had been rejected. Instead, she filled their childhood with simple lessons that mattered more than pride. She taught them to thank the forest before gathering berries, to leave enough mushrooms for the next traveler, and to offer food to strangers before serving themselves. Every evening they sat together on the old porch while the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and Emily would smile as the boys leaned against her shoulders. "Your worth is never decided by the loudest voice in the crowd," she reminded them gently. "It is decided by the choices you make when no one is watching." Ethan always listened quietly, his thoughtful blue eyes reflecting the fading golden sky, while Noah nodded with an eager smile that never seemed to disappear. The years passed like drifting leaves, and the cabin slowly became a home built with patience instead of wealth. Ethan learned to repair broken fences, chop firewood, and carry heavy sacks without being asked. Noah discovered he could calm frightened animals with nothing more than a soft voice and gentle hands. Injured birds seemed to trust him immediately, and even frightened deer lingered nearby instead of running away. Emily noticed these little moments, but never encouraged the boys to think they were unusual. The world had already judged them once. She wanted them to grow into kind men before they learned anything about power. Every few months, someone from Silver Hollow wandered close enough to the cabin to recognize them. The visitors rarely stayed long. Some offered awkward sympathy. Others simply stared before quietly leaving. A few children whispered the same words their parents had repeated for years. Worthless pups. Ethan heard those words more often than Emily realized. He never answered them. Instead, he would gather another bundle of firewood or help Noah repair the vegetable garden, pretending the comments floated past like harmless wind. One crisp autumn afternoon, when the twins had just turned 16, Emily watched them splitting logs beside the creek. Ethan lifted a thick oak round that should have required a grown alpha, yet he handled it with effortless balance before setting it down as though he had not noticed its weight. Noah looked at his brother with quiet surprise, but Ethan simply smiled and continued working. Emily felt an unfamiliar uneasiness settle in her heart. For months, she had noticed little things that refused to make sense. Wolves appeared outside the cabin without fear. Birds gathered on the fence each morning. Even the forest itself seemed strangely peaceful whenever Ethan walked beneath the trees. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Emily stepped onto the porch beneath a sky filled with countless stars. She folded her arms against the cool night air and looked toward the distant mountains where Silver Hollow lay hidden beyond the darkness. Somewhere far away, an ancient wolf released a long, echoing howl that rolled gently across the valley. Ethan stirred inside the cabin before the sound had fully faded, opened his eyes for only a moment, and quietly whispered a single sentence into the darkness without knowing why. "I hear you." Winter settled gently across the valley, covering the forest floor with a blanket of sparkling frost that reflected the early morning sun. Life at the cabin remained peaceful, yet something invisible had begun to change around Ethan. It started with the wolves. They no longer stayed hidden among the distant trees. Instead, they watched quietly from the edge of the clearing, their bright eyes following his every movement with calm curiosity rather than fear. Emily noticed them while hanging freshly washed blankets outside, but every time she looked again, the wolves had already disappeared into the pines without making a sound. She told herself it was coincidence. Deep inside, however, she remembered the strange silver moonbeam that had followed her sons on the night they were rejected, and the memory refused to leave her heart. Ethan noticed the changes even more. Whenever he walked into the forest to gather firewood, birds landed on nearby branches instead of flying away. Squirrels climbed down tree trunks to watch him work. Even the old gray wolf that had frightened travelers for years simply sat across a small stream one quiet afternoon, staring at him with patient golden eyes before lowering its head as though greeting an old friend. Ethan stood perfectly still, unsure why the moment felt strangely familiar. Neither fear nor excitement filled his heart. Instead, he felt an unexpected sense of belonging, as though the forest itself recognized something he could not yet understand. Back at the cabin, Noah continued discovering gifts of his own. Injured animals always seemed to recover faster after he cared for them. One rainy evening, he gently wrapped the wing of a small hawk that had collided with an oak tree. By sunrise, the bird stretched both wings without pain before circling happily above the cabin 3 times as though offering silent thanks. Emily smiled at the sight, but her smile faded when she realized similar moments had become almost ordinary. Her sons were changing, and no mother could ignore it forever. A few days later, Ethan and Noah traveled into a nearby village to trade vegetables, fresh bread, and handmade baskets for flour and lamp oil. While Noah spoke cheerfully with the shopkeeper, Ethan noticed a frightened little girl frozen beside the road, unable to coax her family's stubborn horse across a narrow wooden bridge. Before anyone else could help, Ethan slowly approached the nervous animal. He placed one hand against its neck and whispered so softly that no one could hear the words. Within seconds, the horse relaxed completely, lowered its head, and calmly crossed the bridge beside him. The villagers exchanged puzzled glances. One elderly farmer quietly removed his hat, I have only seen something like that once, he murmured. Many years ago. Ethan simply smiled, handed the reins back to the grateful child, and continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. That evening, hidden among the trees overlooking the cabin, an elderly traveler wrapped in a weathered dark cloak lowered the hood from his silver hair. His name was Gideon Ashcroft, one of the oldest surviving members of the Royal Council. For weeks he had quietly observed the twins from a distance after hearing impossible rumors spreading through neighboring territories. Now he watched Ethan split firewood while a circle of wild wolves rested peacefully only a few yards away. Gideon's steady expression slowly changed into disbelief. He reached beneath his cloak and unfolded an ancient parchment covered with faded royal markings. His eyes moved from the drawing on the brittle page to the young man working beside the cabin. Every detail matched. The quiet strength, the calm spirit, even the wolves. Gideon folded the parchment with careful hands and whispered into the silent forest. After all these years, the true heir has finally awakened. The first sign that something had changed beyond the forest came with the smoke. It rose above the distant treetops just after sunrise, forming a gray ribbon that stretched across the clear winter sky. Emily paused while hanging fresh herbs outside the cabin, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Silver Hollow was many miles away, yet even from that distance, she could sense an uneasiness she had not felt in years. By noon, frightened deer were racing through the woods in unusual numbers, followed by rabbits, foxes, and birds abandoning their familiar nesting grounds. The forest itself seemed to be whispering a warning. Ethan watched the frightened animals pass through the clearing without speaking. They were not simply fleeing. They were searching for safety. Noah gently filled wooden bowls with fresh water and placed them beside the cabin, smiling softly as exhausted creatures gathered without hesitation. Emily felt both pride and concern as she watched her sons care for every living thing that crossed their path. Before long, hurried footsteps echoed along the narrow trail leading toward the cabin. A young woman carrying a frightened little boy stumbled into the clearing, her coat covered with melting snow and her breathing uneven from the long journey. Behind her came an elderly man supporting his injured ankle with a walking stick, followed by several more travelers who looked tired rather than dangerous. Emily recognized their clothing immediately. They belonged to Silver Hollow. For a long moment, no one spoke. The same people who had once turned away from her now stood silently outside the little home she had built with her own hands. Finally, the young mother lowered her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "We were told you might help us." Emily looked at the frightened child hiding behind his mother's coat before quietly opening the cabin door. "Come inside," she said with gentle warmth. "No one should be left outside in this weather." Ethan and Noah immediately began carrying extra chairs, blankets, and warm soup to every visitor without asking who they were or what they had once believed. As the afternoon passed, the travelers slowly explained what had happened. The old alpha of Silver Hollow had fallen seriously ill, leaving the pack divided by fear and uncertainty. Rival leaders argued over every decision. Hunters no longer worked together. Families had begun leaving in search of safer places. Hope had quietly disappeared long before food became scarce. Emily listened without interrupting, offering fresh bread to every guest before serving herself. One elderly woman finally looked into Emily's eyes, tears quietly forming. "We judged you," she admitted. "We judged your boys before they had taken their first steps." Emily simply smiled with the same quiet kindness she had carried for 16 years. "The past cannot feed hungry people," she answered gently. "But kindness can." Outside the cabin, Gideon Ashcroft remained hidden among the pines, silently watching everything unfold. He had expected the young heir to display unusual strength. Instead, he witnessed something even rarer. Ethan never once asked why these strangers had come. He chopped more firewood, repaired a broken wagon wheel for an elderly traveler, and carried heavy supplies as though serving others came as naturally as breathing. Gideon slowly nodded to himself. The old royal records had always described the greatest alpha kings with the same forgotten words. They did not inspire loyalty through fear. They inspired it through compassion. As evening settled across the valley, the exhausted travelers prepared to leave before darkness fully covered the mountain roads. The little boy who had hidden behind his mother all afternoon suddenly ran back toward Ethan and placed a small carved wooden wolf into his hand. "You are the strongest man I have ever met," the child said with complete sincerity. Ethan smiled, thanked him, and tucked the tiny carving safely into his pocket. High above the forest, the wind shifted once again, carrying with it the distant sound of ceremonial horns echoing from Silver Hollow, announcing that the ancient trial of the Alpha would begin before the next full moon. The announcement echoed through every valley before the snow had finished melting from the hills. The ancient trial of the Alpha would begin in 7 days, calling every qualified wolf from neighboring packs to Silver Hollow. For most families, it was simply another tradition. For Gideon Ashcroft, it was the moment he had waited nearly 2 decades to witness. At sunrise, he stepped from the shelter of the forest and walked toward the little cabin with steady confidence, carrying nothing except a weathered leather satchel and the carved oak staff that marked his place within the royal council. Emily opened the door before he could knock, as though she had sensed his arrival long before she heard his footsteps. The moment their eyes met, a forgotten memory returned to her. She had seen this man once before on the night her sons were born, standing silently beyond the moonstone circle before disappearing into the crowd. Gideon removed his gloves and bowed respectfully. "Emily Carter," he said gently, "I owe you an apology that is 16 years overdue." Emily invited him inside, without asking another question. Ethan and Noah greeted the elderly traveler with the same warmth they offered every stranger, placing a fresh cup of tea before him and pulling another chair closer to the fireplace. Gideon studied the brothers carefully. Ethan carried quiet confidence without arrogance, while Noah moved through the room with effortless kindness, noticing every small need before anyone spoke it aloud. The old councilman smiled to himself. The royal records had been right all along. Character revealed blood long before power ever could. After a long silence, Gideon carefully opened his satchel and placed a small silver pendant onto the wooden table. At its center rested the image of a crescent moon surrounding a wolf's crown. Emily's hands immediately began to tremble. She had not seen that symbol since the night a young man with gentle blue eyes had promised to return for her beneath the same full moon that now seemed so many years away. Gideon looked at Ethan before speaking. "Your father was not an ordinary wolf," he said quietly. "His name was Alexander Ashcroft, the rightful heir to the royal bloodline." The cabin became perfectly silent. Ethan exchanged a confused glance with Noah, while Emily slowly closed her eyes. She had buried that truth deep within her heart to protect her sons from the dangerous ambitions that surrounded the royal family. She had believed the secret would disappear with time. Instead, destiny had patiently waited. Gideon continued in a calm voice. "Alexander vanished before he could claim the throne. Most believed the bloodline had ended forever. They were wrong." He turned toward Ethan and gently placed the silver pendant into his hands. The moment Ethan touched the cool metal, the pendant released a soft silver glow that illuminated the room without heat or flame. Noah stared in amazement. Emily covered her mouth, unable to speak. Gideon nodded with quiet certainty. The royal blood recognizes only its true heir. Ethan looked down at the glowing symbol resting in his palm. Nothing about him felt different, yet something deep within his heart awakened with an indescribable sense of familiarity, as though a forgotten melody had finally found its final note. Outside, the wolves gathered once again along the edge of the forest, sitting silently beneath the tall pines with their eyes fixed upon the cabin. Gideon watched them through the window before turning back to Ethan. "In 7 days," he said softly, "the Moonstone will choose the next alpha before every pack in the kingdom. You may enter that trial as an unknown young man, but if destiny unfolds as it was written long ago, you will not leave as one." The morning of the trial arrived beneath a sky so clear that every snow-covered peak seemed close enough to touch. Wolves from dozens of neighboring packs filled the enormous Moonstone arena, their voices blending into a restless wave of anticipation that echoed across the valley. Banners bearing ancient family crests fluttered in the crisp mountain breeze, while members of the royal council took their places around the sacred circle. Emily stood quietly near the outer edge of the gathering with Noah beside her, keeping their heads lowered as familiar faces glanced toward them with quiet curiosity. Many recognized the woman they had once dismissed, but few recognized the two young men who had grown beyond every expectation. Ethan stepped into the arena wearing a simple dark jacket and well-worn boots, dressed no differently than he had been while repairing fences beside the cabin only days before. A ripple of laughter spread through the spectators. Some whispered that an unknown woodsman had wandered into a ceremony meant for future leaders. Others remembered the rejected twins from years ago and exchanged amused smiles. Ethan heard every word, yet his expression remained calm. Gideon Ashcroft watched from the council platform with complete confidence, saying nothing as the names of experienced alpha candidates were announced one by one. Each competitor approached the ancient moonstone, placing a hand upon its smooth silver surface. The sacred stone shimmered faintly for some, remained silent for others, but never released the brilliant light spoken of in old legends. One after another, hopeful leaders stepped aside, disappointment hidden behind practiced smiles. Finally, the chief elder raised his voice. Ethan Carter. For a brief moment, silence settled over the arena before scattered laughter returned. Ethan walked forward without hurry, every step steady and unforced. Emily quietly folded her hands together, not out of fear, but out of hope. Noah offered her a reassuring smile. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "he already knows who he is." Ethan reached the center of the sacred circle and rested his hand against the moonstone. Nothing happened for a single heartbeat. Then another. A few spectators began shaking their heads. Suddenly, a brilliant silver light burst from the stone, rising high above the arena like the first sunrise after a long winter. The laughter vanished instantly. Ancient symbols carved around the sacred platform awakened one after another, glowing with radiant light that had not been seen for generations. A powerful yet peaceful energy swept across the valley, carrying with it a warm breeze despite the winter air. Every wolf felt it. The wolves gathered beyond the arena lifted their heads toward the sky and released a single unified howl that echoed across the mountains. Ethan slowly opened his eyes as the silver pendant resting beneath his jacket shone with the same unmistakable light. He did not feel stronger than anyone else. He simply felt complete, as though every unanswered question from his childhood had quietly found its answer. Members of the royal council rose from their seats without speaking. Gideon was the first to bow. One by one, the elders followed until every council member stood with head lowered before the young man they had searched for across 16 long years. The chief elder stepped forward, his voice filled with awe rather than ceremony. "The moon has spoken," he declared. "The royal bloodline lives." Across the arena, Emily felt tears quietly fill her eyes, not because her son had been chosen, but because the same world that had once measured him by a silent stone at birth was now witnessing the truth with its own eyes. Ethan turned toward his mother before looking across the thousands gathered in silence. He offered no boast, no challenge, and no anger. Instead, he simply smiled with the same quiet kindness she had taught him beside a little cabin deep within the forest, and in that single moment, many understood that true greatness had never been waiting inside the moonstone. It had been growing in the heart of a boy who had refused to become bitter. Silence lingered over the moonstone arena long after the silver light faded, as though the entire kingdom needed a few more heartbeats to accept what it had just witnessed. The same voices that had laughed only moments earlier now spoke in quiet whispers filled with disbelief. One by one, wolves who had once stood proudly with folded arms slowly lowered their eyes. Some remembered the night two newborn boys had been judged without mercy. Others remembered turning away from a young Omega mother who had walked home alone carrying nothing except her children and her dignity. Those memories suddenly felt heavier than any crown. Emily remained exactly where she had been standing, overwhelmed not by victory, but by gratitude. She had spent 16 years asking for nothing except the chance for her sons to grow into good men. The honor surrounding Ethan now was never the dream she had chased. It was simply the unexpected reward for refusing to let bitterness become part of her family. Noah gently squeezed her hand before smiling toward his brother, his expression filled with the quiet pride that only family could understand. Across the arena, the chief elder slowly descended from the council platform and stopped a few feet before Emily. His silver hair moved softly in the mountain breeze as he lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps spread through the gathering. No elder had knelt before an Omega in living memory. Emily Carter, he said with sincere humility. Our greatest mistake was believing we understood destiny better than compassion. His words opened a door that pride had kept closed for years. Another elder stepped forward and bowed. Then another. Soon the leaders of Silver Hollow stood before the woman they had once ignored, offering respect instead of judgment. Emily did not celebrate their apology. She simply invited them to stand again with the same gentle smile that had never disappeared from her face. Kindness loses its meaning if it waits for perfect people, she answered softly. Let us begin again. Her response spread through the crowd more powerfully than any speech. Parents quietly reached for the hands of their children. Young wolves looked at one another differently. Even those who had spoken the harshest words found themselves wishing they had chosen kindness years earlier. Ethan walked calmly through the gathering, greeting every elder with respect and every child with the same warm smile he had always carried. He did not stop before those who had mocked him to demand apologies. Instead, he thanked the volunteers who had prepared the ceremony, helped an elderly council member down a set of stone steps, and paused to return the carved wooden wolf the little boy had given him days before. Keep this, Ethan said with a gentle smile. One day you will pass it to someone who needs hope more than you do. The child nodded with shining eyes, holding the little carving as though it had become the greatest treasure he had ever owned. As the afternoon sun settled over the valley, representatives from neighboring packs quietly approached Gideon Ashcroft. None questioned the Moonstone's decision anymore. They had witnessed something greater than a sign of royal blood. They had witnessed the character of the one chosen to lead. Gideon looked toward Ethan and allowed himself the smallest smile. The old prophecies had spoken of a king whose greatest strength would not be the power of his wolf, but the gentleness of his heart. Watching Ethan help his mother gather the simple basket she had brought from home instead of accepting royal servants to carry it, Gideon realized the prophecy had never been about a throne. It had always been about restoring the soul of a kingdom that had forgotten how to measure true worth. The coronation was scheduled for the following evening beneath the oldest oak in the kingdom, where generations of leaders had stood before the Moonstone to pledge their lives to the protection of every pack, every family, and every child. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the western mountains, thousands gathered once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was no restless competition, no whispered judgment, and no eager search for power. Instead, quiet anticipation filled the valley as wolves from distant territories stood side by side, united by the extraordinary events they had witnessed only a day before. Emily and Noah arrived wearing the same simple clothing they had always owned. Although members of the royal council had offered them elaborate ceremonial garments, Emily had politely declined. She wanted to stand before the kingdom exactly as she had stood before her sons every day of their lives, honest, humble, and grateful. Ethan walked toward the sacred platform with calm confidence, carrying no weapon and wearing no crown. Gideon Ashcroft stepped beside the ancient Moonstone and raised the royal pendant into the evening light. For 16 years, he announced, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, the kingdom believed the royal bloodline had vanished. Today we celebrate not only its return, but the return of the values that once made this kingdom worthy of its people. As he finished speaking, the Moonstone released its familiar silver glow, brighter than before yet peaceful enough to illuminate every face without casting a single shadow. From a carved stone pedestal beside the altar, an ancient crown slowly began to shine. It had rested untouched for decades, preserved not by locks or guards, but by a tradition that declared only the rightful heir could receive it. No one reached for the crown. Instead, to the amazement of everyone present, it gently lifted into the air as though guided by an invisible hand. The entire valley watched in complete silence while it floated across the sacred circle before settling gently upon Ethan's head. No voice declared him worthy. No elder placed the crown upon him. The kingdom understood immediately. The choice had not come from tradition. It had come from destiny itself. A warm breeze swept through the towering pines, carrying the scent of cedar and wildflowers even though winter still lingered in the mountains. Beyond the ceremony, wolves standing along the forest's edge lowered their heads together, joined moments later by every member of the gathered packs. One after another, thousands knelt, not out of fear but out of respect freely given. Ethan looked across the sea of faces before turning toward Emily. Slowly, he stepped down from the platform and stopped in front of his mother. Without hesitation, the newly crowned Alpha King lowered himself onto one knee before her. A quiet gasp spread across the gathering. Ethan looked into her tear-filled eyes and smiled with the same warmth she had known since the day he first learned to walk. "Everything I have become," he said gently, "began with the home you built when the world offered us none." Emily rested a trembling hand against his cheek, unable to speak through her emotion. Noah quietly wiped away a tear before placing one reassuring hand upon his brother's shoulder. In that unforgettable moment, every wolf present understood that greatness was not measured by royal blood alone. It was shaped by the quiet sacrifices made inside a small cabin hidden deep within the forest, where a mother had chosen love over resentment every single day. As the first stars appeared above the valley, the bells of every neighboring pack rang together across the mountains, welcoming not simply a new Alpha King, but the beginning of a new chapter built upon mercy, humility, and hope. Spring arrived slowly across the kingdom, replacing snow with fields of wildflowers that stretched across the valleys surrounding Silver Hollow. Months had passed since the coronation, yet visitors continued traveling for miles simply to witness the changes unfolding under Ethan's leadership. The great gates that had once welcomed only the strongest wolves now stood open to every family seeking safety, wisdom, or a fresh beginning. The first decree of the new Alpha King surprised nearly everyone. No newborn would ever again be judged by scent, rank, or the expectations of others. Every child, regardless of bloodline, would receive the same blessing beneath the moonstone and the same opportunity to discover who they were meant to become. The announcement spread quickly from one territory to another, and before long other packs quietly began adopting the same tradition. Noah accepted a new role that seemed perfectly suited to the compassion he had always carried. Working beside experienced healers, he transformed the old council hall into a place where anyone could receive care without fear of status or payment. Travelers often remarked that peace seemed easier to find inside those walls than anywhere else in the kingdom. Emily visited often, bringing baskets filled with fresh bread, herbs, and flowers from the little garden she still kept beside the cabin. She refused every offer to move into the royal residence. "Home is where love learned to grow," she would say with a gentle smile. Ethan understood immediately. The cabin remained exactly as it had always been, its wooden porch overlooking Cedar Creek, its windows glowing warmly every evening. Although he now carried the responsibilities of an entire kingdom, he returned there whenever his duties allowed, splitting firewood beside Noah, repairing loose fence posts, and sharing simple meals around the same worn table where his family had once dreamed of nothing more than another peaceful tomorrow. One quiet afternoon, Ethan noticed a young Omega mother standing nervously near the entrance to the Moonstone Circle, holding her newborn daughter close while avoiding the eyes of those around her. Without hesitation, he walked toward her, knelt so he could meet her at eye level, and smiled with reassuring kindness. "Welcome," he said softly. "Your little one belongs here." The young mother blinked back grateful tears as the gathered crowd stepped aside, making room for her family without hesitation. Among those watching from the edge of the ceremony stood several elders who remembered another mother carrying twin boys into the same sacred place many years before. This time, no laughter followed. Only warm applause echoed beneath the ancient trees. As evening settled over the valley, Emily stood alone for a moment outside the old cabin, watching Ethan and Noah laugh together while repairing the garden fence exactly as they had done countless times before. The crowns, titles, and ceremonies had changed many things, but they had not changed the hearts of her sons. They still greeted strangers with kindness, still worked with their own hands, and still believed every person deserved dignity before judgment. Emily lifted her eyes toward the full moon rising above the pines, remembering the lonely night she had walked away from the Moonstone, carrying 2 sleeping babies and a heart full of unanswered questions. Back then, the future had seemed hidden beyond endless darkness. Now she understood that destiny had never abandoned her family. It had simply been growing quietly, one act of kindness at a time, until the entire kingdom was finally ready to see it. And long after the stories of crowns and royal blood became legends told beside warm fireplaces, people remembered something even greater. They remembered that the strongest leader of his generation had first been raised by a mother who answered rejection with grace, hardship with hope, and every ordinary day with extraordinary love.